The rain began as a thin gray curtain on the horizon, barely visible against the endless prairie. Most travelers would have hurried toward the nearest town or searched for shelter before the storm arrived. Jacob did neither. He simply adjusted the brim of his weathered hat and continued riding. At 40 years old, Jacob had spent so many years alone that storms no longer bothered him. Rain was rain, wind was wind. Cold nights and long roads were as familiar to him as breathing. The world kept moving, and so did he. His horse, Rusty, plodded steadily beside a winding trail that cut through the Wyoming territory. The chestnut gelding was getting older, much like his owner, but he remained dependable. Jacob trusted Rusty more than he trusted most people. The two had traveled together for nearly 8 years. That was longer than Jacob had stayed anywhere else. The prairie stretched endlessly in every direction. Tall grass bent beneath the wind, creating waves that rolled across the land like an ocean. Far away, dark clouds gathered strength. Jacob glanced toward them and sighed. "Looks like we're getting wet today, partner." Rusty flicked his ears. The horse was the closest thing Jacob had to family. Years ago, things had been different. There had been people in his life, friends, plans, dreams of settling down somewhere. But life had a way of changing course without asking permission. Disappointments had piled up one after another until Jacob finally learned a lesson he believed was true above all others. People leave. Sometimes they leave by choice. Sometimes fate takes them away. Either way, counting on others only led to heartache. So he stopped counting on anyone. The decision had made life simpler, lonelier perhaps, but simpler. He drifted from town to town, taking whatever honest work he could find. Some months he repaired fences. Other months he helped move cattle or delivered supplies across rough country. He never stayed long enough for anyone to know him well. The moment people started asking personal questions, Jacob usually saddled Rusty and rode away. It was easier that way. No attachments, no goodbyes, no disappointments. As afternoon faded toward evening, the sky darkened rapidly. The approaching storm moved faster than expected. Thunder rumbled across the plains. Rusty lifted his head uneasily. "Easy now," Jacob said. A cold gust swept across the grassland, then another. Within minutes, rain began falling heavily. Jacob narrowed his eyes and searched the horizon. He spotted a line of cottonwood trees in the distance. Perhaps there would be shelter nearby. Guiding Rusty away from the main trail, he headed toward the trees. The ground beneath them had already become soft from recent rainfall. Mud clung to Rusty's hooves. Still, Jacob pressed forward. The storm intensified. Rain hammered against his coat. Lightning flashed across the dark sky. By the time they reached the trees, visibility had become poor. Jacob discovered a narrow creek winding through the area. Normally, crossing it would have been simple. Today, however, the recent rains had transformed the ground into a slippery mess. He considered turning back. Then another crack of thunder shook the air. "No point now," he muttered. Rusty stepped carefully down a muddy bank. For a moment, everything seemed fine. Then the horse stumbled. A sharp splash echoed through the storm. Rusty's front legs sank unexpectedly into a hidden patch of deep mud. The horse panicked immediately. Jacob jumped from the saddle. "Whoa, easy!" Rusty struggled harder. That only made matters worse. The mud tightened around his legs like a trap. Jacob grabbed the reins and tried calming him. "Easy, boy, easy." Rain poured relentlessly around them. For nearly an hour, Jacob worked alone. He removed the saddle. He searched for branches. He tried creating leverage. Nothing worked. The more Rusty struggled, the deeper he sank. Exhaustion crept into Jacob's muscles. His hands became coated with mud. Water dripped from the brim of his hat. For the first time in years, he felt something dangerously close to helplessness. If Rusty became injured, everything would change. The horse wasn't just transportation. Rusty was his livelihood, his companion. His responsibility. Jacob leaned against a tree and wiped rain from his face. The nearest town was miles away. Finding help before nightfall seemed impossible. Still, the thought of asking for assistance bothered him. He had spent years proving he could handle problems on his own. Surely he could solve this one too. Another hour passed. Darkness began settling across the prairie. Rusty's breathing grew heavier. Jacob's confidence faded. Then through the sound of rain, he heard something unexpected, hoofbeats. At first he thought he imagined them. Then a voice called out, "Hello." Jacob turned sharply. A rider emerged through the storm. The figure guided a gray horse confidently across the muddy ground. As she approached, Jacob could finally see her clearly. She appeared to be around 30 years old. Despite the rain, her features were striking. Golden brown hair peeked from beneath her hat. Her calm eyes scanned the situation quickly. She wasn't frightened. She wasn't uncertain. She looked capable. The woman brought her horse to a stop. "Well," she said, surveying Rusty's predicament, "that's quite a mess." Jacob straightened. "I've got it handled." The woman raised an eyebrow. The horse sank another inch. "Are you sure about that?" Jacob didn't answer. For a moment, neither spoke. Rain continued falling around them. Then the woman offered a small, friendly smile. It wasn't mocking. It wasn't pity. It was simple kindness. "Let me help you," she said gently. Jacob almost refused immediately. The words were already forming in his mind. But before he could speak, another flash of lightning illuminated the storm-dark prairie. He looked at Rusty, then back at the stranger. For the first time in a very long while, Jacob found himself standing at a crossroads he hadn't expected. One path was pride. The other was accepting a helping hand from someone he had never met. And as the storm raged around them, he realized he might not have much choice. The storm continued through most of the night. After gathering several ranch hands and securing strong ropes, the woman had helped free Rusty from the mud. The rescue took nearly an hour, but the horse escaped with only a strained leg and a great deal of exhaustion. By the time everything was finished, darkness had settled completely over the prairie. The woman introduced herself as Sara. She owned the nearby ranch. When she learned Rusty could not travel safely, she insisted Jacob stay until the horse recovered. Jacob had argued. Sara had ignored him. Now, 3 mornings later, he sat on the porch of the ranch house watching sunlight spread across rolling fields. He had intended to leave at dawn on the first day. Then Rusty needed rest. The second day brought swollen joints and soreness. On the third day, the ranch's veterinarian advised waiting a little longer. Jacob disliked every minute of depending on someone else's hospitality. Yet he could not deny one thing. Sara's ranch was unlike any place he had visited before. The property stretched across wide grasslands bordered by gentle hills. Horses grazed peacefully in distant pastures. A creek wound through the land, providing water even during dry months. The large barn stood near several smaller buildings, all maintained with obvious care. Most surprising of all was the atmosphere. The ranch felt alive. Workers greeted one another by name. Laughter drifted from the bunkhouse during meals. People worked hard, but nobody seemed miserable. Jacob wasn't accustomed to such places. For years he had moved from one temporary job to another. He rarely stayed long enough to become part of anything. Sara stepped onto the porch carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Morning," she said. Jacob nodded. She handed him a cup. "Rusty seems stronger today." "He does." "Good." For a moment they watched the fields in comfortable silence. "You know," Sara said, "most people would be grateful for free lodging and coffee." Jacob glanced at her. "Most people aren't me." She laughed softly. "No, they certainly aren't." The sound caught him off guard. It wasn't forced or polite. It was genuine. Something about that made him smile despite himself. The expression disappeared quickly, but Sara noticed. She pretended not to. Later that morning, Jacob wandered toward the corrals. Several ranch hands were repairing a damaged section of fence. Without thinking, he stopped to help. Within minutes, he was hammering posts into place. The work felt familiar, comfortable. By midday, the repairs were finished. One of the ranch hands, a cheerful man named Ben, wiped sweat from his forehead. "You work pretty fast." Jacob shrugged. "Done it before." "Looks like you've done everything before." Jacob offered no response. Ben merely grinned. Unlike most people, the ranch hand seemed content to let conversations come naturally. Nobody pressed for personal details. Nobody demanded explanations. As the days passed, Jacob found himself helping more often. One morning, he assisted with moving cattle. Another day, he repaired a broken wagon wheel. Whenever he noticed work needing attention, he simply joined in. Sara never asked him to, yet she always thanked him afterward. The simple appreciation felt strangely unfamiliar. One evening, they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky with shades of orange and gold. "Where did you learn all those skills?" Sara asked. Jacob stared toward the horizon. "Years on the road." "You've traveled that much?" "Enough." Sara nodded. She seemed willing to accept short answers. Eventually, she began sharing her own story. Her father had built the ranch from almost nothing. After his death several years earlier, many neighboring ranchers assumed Sara would sell the property. Some believed a woman could not manage such a large operation. Others expected failure. Instead, she worked harder than anyone. Slowly, she earned the respect of workers and neighbors alike. As she spoke, Jacob noticed something. Sara never bragged about her accomplishments. She simply described the challenges and the effort required to overcome them. That impressed him. Strength was common in the West. Quiet strength was much rarer. Days turned into a week. Rusty improved steadily. The horse trotted comfortably again. Jacob knew he could leave soon, yet each morning he found another reason to stay one more day. Perhaps he wanted to ensure Rusty recovered completely. Perhaps he simply enjoyed the ranch. He wasn't ready to examine the truth too closely. One Saturday, Sara approached him while he worked near the barn. "The town's holding a social gathering tonight." Jacob immediately shook his head. "No, you haven't even heard the invitation." "Still no." Sara crossed her arms. "You're predictable. I'll take that as a compliment." It wasn't one. Jacob chuckled quietly, another reaction that surprised him. Sara pointed toward him. "There it is again." "What? That laugh? I didn't laugh. You absolutely did." Jacob returned to his work. Sara smiled victoriously. Several hours later, he found himself riding beside her toward town. He wasn't entirely sure how that had happened. The gathering occupied a large community hall. Lanterns illuminated the building. Music drifted through open windows. Families filled the space with conversation and laughter. Children ran between tables while neighbors exchanged stories. Jacob felt uncomfortable immediately. Crowds were not his favorite thing, yet as the evening progressed, he observed something unexpected. People cared about one another here. When someone needed assistance, neighbors stepped forward. When good news arrived, everyone celebrated together. When hardships appeared, nobody faced them alone. Jacob watched an elderly rancher dancing with his wife. He saw children helping decorate tables. He noticed friendships built over years of shared experiences. The sight stirred something deep inside him. A feeling he had spent years trying to ignore. Loneliness, not the kind caused by temporary solitude, a deeper loneliness. The kind that came from believing you had nowhere to belong. Later that evening, he stood outside beneath a sky crowded with stars. Sara joined him. "Too noisy in there?" She asked. "A little." They leaned against a fence. The night air felt cool and pleasant. "You seem thoughtful," Sara said. Jacob remained silent for several seconds. "Just thinking. Dangerous activity." He smiled again. The smile lingered longer this time. For a while, neither spoke. The silence felt comfortable rather than awkward. Jacob realized he enjoyed moments like these. That realization unsettled him, because enjoying someone's company often led to caring, and caring led to risk. The more time he spent at the ranch, the more attached he became, not only to Sara. To the workers, to the routine, to the feeling of waking each morning with familiar faces nearby. Those attachments frightened him. Old memories returned. Losses, disappointments, people who had vanished from his life. He had spent years protecting himself from that pain. What if staying meant risking it again? Several days later, Rusty was fully recovered. The veterinarian confirmed the horse was healthy enough to travel. Jacob thanked him politely. Then he spent the afternoon alone. By evening, his decision was made. He would leave. The ranch had become too comfortable, too important. If he stayed longer, walking away would become impossible. Before sunrise the next morning, Jacob quietly saddled Rusty. The ranch remained silent. Most people were still asleep. A faint light glowed in the eastern sky. He mounted the horse and took one final look around. The barn, the fields. The house, memories formed far too quickly. Jacob tightened his grip on the reins. Then he turned Rusty toward the open prairie, without leaving a note, without saying goodbye, without giving himself the chance to change his mind. As the ranch slowly disappeared behind him, an unfamiliar emptiness settled inside his chest. For years he had ridden away from places without regret. This time felt different, and deep down, Jacob feared he already knew why. Jacob rode for 3 days before admitting something was wrong. Nothing around him had changed. The prairie remained wide and beautiful. The open sky stretched endlessly above him. The trail continued winding through familiar country, yet the freedom he had always valued felt strangely hollow. For years, leaving had been easy. Whenever a place became too familiar or people started getting too close, he simply saddled Rusty and moved on. The road always welcomed him. New horizons always waited ahead. Now, for the first time, the road felt empty. Each evening he built a campfire beneath the stars. Each morning he packed his bedroll and continued west. But his thoughts constantly drifted back to Sara's ranch. He remembered workers laughing during supper. He remembered sunsets on the porch. Most of all, he remembered Sara, her quiet confidence, her kindness. The way she never pressured him to become someone else. The memories followed him everywhere. One evening, while sitting beside a small fire, Jacob stared into the flames. Rusty grazed nearby. The horse seemed content. Jacob wasn't. He finally spoke aloud. "What are you doing?" The question was directed at himself. For years he had convinced himself that solitude was enough. Now he wasn't so certain. Perhaps he had mistaken isolation for independence. Perhaps there was a difference between being free and being alone. The realization unsettled him. Weeks passed. Jacob continued drifting from town to town. He accepted temporary jobs and earned enough money to support himself. Outwardly, nothing appeared different. Inside, however, everything had changed. One afternoon, he stopped at a small trading post near a crossroads. Several ranchers stood outside discussing local concerns. Jacob wasn't paying much attention until he heard a familiar name. Sara. His attention sharpened immediately. "Many ranches are struggling this season," one rancher said. "The drought's getting worse." Another nodded. "Heard Sara's place has been hit hard too." Jacob listened carefully. Months of unusually dry weather had reduced water supplies throughout the region. Creeks were shrinking. Pastures were suffering. Every ranch faced difficult decisions. Sara's operation remained standing, but the challenges were growing. Jacob thanked the men for the information and returned to Rusty. For several minutes he stood beside the horse without moving. His thoughts raced. Part of him insisted the situation wasn't his concern. Sara had managed difficult circumstances before. She didn't need him, yet another part of him remembered something important. She had helped him without hesitation when he needed it. She had never asked for anything in return. Jacob mounted Rusty. The horse turned his head expectantly. "Well, partner," Jacob said quietly, "looks like we're heading back." The journey took several days. As the ranch finally appeared on the horizon, Jacob felt nervous. The feeling surprised him. He had faced storms, dangerous trails, and countless uncertainties. Yet the thought of seeing Sara again made his stomach tighten. What if she was angry? What if she felt betrayed by his sudden departure? What if she simply didn't care that he had returned? The questions followed him all the way to the ranch gate. A ranch hand spotted him first. "Jacob!" Within minutes, several workers gathered nearby. Their reactions weren't cold. They weren't hostile. If anything, they seemed genuinely pleased to see him. The welcome eased some of his concerns. Then Sara emerged from the barn. For a moment, neither moved. Months had passed since they last saw each other. Jacob prepared himself for disappointment. Instead, Sara smiled. It was the same warm smile he remembered. "You came back," she said. Jacob nodded. "Looks that way." Sara stepped closer. "I was beginning to think the prairie had swallowed you." "Almost did." She laughed softly. The familiar sound immediately made the ranch feel like home. No accusations followed, no questions about why he had left. Sara simply seemed happy he was there. The kindness affected him more deeply than he expected. Over the following weeks, Jacob remained at the ranch. At first, he told himself he was only helping during the drought, nothing more. Yet every day strengthened his connection to the place. Water shortages required careful planning. Jacob drew upon years of experience gathered across the West. He suggested alternate grazing routes. He helped repair aging irrigation equipment. He located an old spring several miles away that could provide additional water. The work wasn't glamorous, but it mattered. Slowly, conditions improved. The ranch still faced challenges, yet hope returned. One evening, after a particularly long day, Jacob and Sara sat together on the porch. The sky glowed with fading colors. Crickets chirped in the distance. For several minutes, they watched the sunset in silence. Finally, Jacob spoke. "There was a reason I left." Sara glanced toward him. "I figured there was." Most people would have demanded an explanation months earlier. Sara simply waited. The patience encouraged honesty. Jacob took a deep breath, then he told her everything. He spoke about the losses he had experienced years before, the friendships that ended, the dreams that failed, the people he had cared about and eventually lost. He explained how each disappointment pushed him further toward isolation. Eventually, he stopped allowing anyone close enough to hurt him. The road became a refuge, a place where expectations couldn't exist. When he finished, darkness had settled across the ranch. Sara remained quiet for several moments, then she said something simple. "That sounds lonely." Jacob stared into the distance. "It was safer, maybe." She folded her hands. "But safer isn't always better." Jacob considered her words. Sara continued gently. Needing people doesn't make you weak. Sometimes it's what makes life worth living. The sentence lingered in the evening air. Jacob didn't answer immediately. He didn't need to, because deep down he knew she was right. Over the following days, he found himself thinking about those words constantly. For years, he had been running from pain. In the process, he had also been running from connection, from friendship, from belonging. Eventually, the truth became impossible to ignore. He no longer wanted to leave. One evening, several weeks later, Jacob found Sara near the horse pasture. The setting sun painted the fields with golden light. Rusty grazed nearby. Jacob felt unusually nervous. "There's something I've been meaning to ask," he said. Sara looked at him expectantly. He took a breath. "Do you think there might be a place for me here?" Sara smiled immediately. The answer seemed obvious to her. "There always has been." Relief washed through him, not dramatic relief, not overwhelming excitement, something deeper, peace, the kind he had spent years searching for without realizing it. A year later, the ranch looked stronger than ever. The drought had ended. Pastures flourished once again. Workers remained busy, but laughter still filled the property. Jacob had become a permanent part of the ranch. He still rode across the prairie from time to time. Old habits didn't disappear overnight. Yet every journey ended the same way. He came home. One evening, he and Sara sat together on the porch watching the sunset sink below the horizon. The fields glowed beneath the fading light. Rusty grazed peacefully nearby. Jacob reflected on the road that had brought him there. For years, he believed strength meant carrying every burden alone. Now he understood something far more important. The greatest journey of his life had not been crossing rivers, mountains, or endless plains. It had been learning to trust again, learning to belong, learning to accept a helping hand when he needed one. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared beyond the horizon, Jacob smiled. At last, the lonely drifter had found the place he belonged.